Hey race fans, I'm Unsilent, and this year marks the 100th anniversary of one of the world's most iconic motor races, the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Since 1923, cars have been racing through the French countryside in a battle of man and machine to see who can cover the most distance in a full day's racing. Of course, with this being the centenary of 1/3 of Motorsport's Triple Crown, you would expect the festivities to not only take place in real life, but also in the digital realm as well. Unfortunately, current Le Mans license holders Motorsport Games don't appear to have a standalone release coming in time for this weekend's 100th anniversary edition of the 24 Heures du Mans. Considering their attempt at a virtual 24 Hours of Le Mans in January, we're not worse off for that. So instead, let's take a look at some classic Le Mans games that came out right between two big periods for the iconic race. Depending on where you live, you could have bought these games sharing one of two names despite coming out in different years on different console generations. Unless you're me, who has our games in question with two different titles despite buying both in small-town Northern Ontario. It's a generational battle of what we North Americans call Test Drive Le Mans, but the rest of the world calls Le Mans 24 Hours on this episode of Retro Versus. Hello and welcome to Retro Versus, a series in which I look at classic games and usually compare them to modern games in the same franchise or genre. Of course, since I was foiled by a publisher who is subject to a lot of criticism that I don't need to get into because the rest of the world has done that sufficiently already, we're going to take a spin on taking a spin. Let's start with a bit of context. The 24 Hours of Le Mans is what is typically called an endurance race. Back when the race started in 1923, and was officially known as the 24 Hours Grand Prix of Endurance, it was certainly an apt descriptor. The race was a test of man and machine on public roads through and around the town of Le Mans, France, and twice around the clock, as each of the 33 cars and their two drivers were pushed to the limits to log as many miles as possible over 24 hours without breaking themselves or their cars. As time went on, the cars and track evolved. While most of the track still runs on public roads, a portion of it is now on a dedicated closed circuit that links in with those public roads. The cars evolved, with the rules originally focusing on four-seater production cars, but later opened up to sports cars, racing versions of road cars, and full-on dedicated race cars, the latter of which was frequently referred to over the years as prototypes. What sets endurance or sports car racing apart from a lot of the more mainstream forms of motorsport is that these races occur with multiple classes of car on track at the same time. Each team competes for glory in their own class, but also races for the overall win as the absolute fastest car in the race. So as time progressed at Le Mans, you would have dedicated racing cars going up against modified road cars or heavily modified supercars, which all shared the track at the same time. In the 1980s and 90s, the 24 Hours of Le Mans had a bit of a boom period. As car manufacturer interest in Le Mans waned through the 1970s, the FIA, one of motorsport's major sanctioning bodies, introduced the now iconic Group C regulations. These were closed-top prototype cars, with rules focused around certain car dimensions and fuel consumption targets, rather than engine size or power restrictions, which leveled the playing field rather than the previous GTP category, in which power was the deciding factor. The creative freedom allowed to manufacturers with how they approached Group C revitalized interest in the race. Joining perennial contenders Porsche were the likes of Jaguar, Toyota, Mazda, Peugeot, Nissan, Sauber, Mercedes, among many more short-lived and privateer entries. So while you don't see many of those pre-Group C cars in the likes of Gran Turismo, Project Cars, or other sim or simcade games, Group C cars are still quite popular and common in the biggest racing games today. Of course, the FIA couldn't leave well enough alone with Group C, so they meddled with the category until it fizzled out in the early 90s. Fortunately, Le Mans' sanctioning body, the Automobile Club de l'Ouest, quite accidentally landed on their feet with another hit category immediately thereafter. In the mid-90s, the GT1 class was created, but not as the top class at Le Mans. That was supposed to be the prototype category for purpose-built race cars. No, GT1 was supposed to be modified versions of road-going cars, usually the super or hyper cars of the day. Of course, it's not motorsports without people finding a loophole. So while the likes of McLaren with their F1 and Ferrari with the F40 took their popular road cars of the day and modified them for the track, other manufacturers got creative. Using an old trick, several companies created what is called a homologation special, a one-off or limited production car that only really existed so they could legally say that their GT race car was based on an actual road car, when in reality, the road car was more or less reverse engineered from the race car to be road legal enough to meet the regs. That's how we ended up with the likes of the Porsche 911 GT1, the Panoz Esperante GTR1, the Mercedes-Benz CLK GTR, the Toyota GT1, and Nissan R390. They were all allegedly legal per the rules, as they were based on road cars, but making a race car based on a road car was not the intention these manufacturers had in making these cars. In fact, the Toyota and Nissan bore more resemblance to their Group C predecessors than anything that was actually on the road. But as quickly as it rose to prominence, the GT1 class faded away. It only really lasted for 6 years from 1993 to 1998. The category burned brightly, but manufacturers want return on investment, and with rising costs and the likes of Porsche and McLaren dominating Le Mans and Mercedes sweeping the 1998 FIA GT Championship, factory interest dried up almost as quickly as it came. For 1 year in 1999, GT1 was replaced by the Grand Touring Prototype, or GTP category, which carried on with the Toyota GT1 and a new Mercedes, but was otherwise sparsely populated. The emphasis was again on the open-top prototype category, and GTP had no entrance by the year 2000. And that brings us to the era of the two games in question. Test Drive Le Mans and/or Le Mans 24 Hours, the name depends on where you live in the world and what console you got the game on, were both released at an interesting time in the history of the race. The 5th generation console release, originally released in 1999 by Infogrames and developed by Eutechnyx. Wait, Eutechnyx. Why do I know that name?
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Anyway, Eutechnyx's take on Le Mans, that I'll call Test Drive Le Mans since that's what the copy of the game I have is called, was based on the 1998 race with a couple of bonus cars from 1999. The 6th generation game, which I'll call Le Mans 24 Hours since that's what the PlayStation 2 version was called, was developed by Infogrames' Melbourne house and published by Infogrames proper. It was originally released in 2000 for the Sega Dreamcast and was largely based on the 1999 race. The version I owned and is being reviewed here was the 2001 update that was released for PlayStation 2 and PC, which added new cars from the year 2000 edition of the Le Mans 24 Hours. So for putting these two games head to head, let's start with the cars. As mentioned, Test Drive Le Mans was based on the 1998 running of the race, so with the exception of the Mercedes CLK and the lone Le Mans Prototype 2 entrant, all of the cars that ran that year's race were in the game. But to pad out the more road car-based GT2 category's car list, the non-qualifying entry of the Celine Mustang was included, while the 1997 FIA GT and Le Mans entries from Team Marcos and Augusta Racing also made the game. Without those three, the GT2 field at Le Mans and in the game for 98 would have just been Vipers and 911s. But in total, there were 24 different teams represented before the three bonus cars, which were split between the 1998 categories of GT2, GT1, and Prototype. The extra development afforded for the next-gen release, first on the Dreamcast in 2000, then a year later on the PlayStation 2, allowed Melbourne House to add some 1999 Le Mans entrants into the car list, along with a few Group C legends to the already established 1998 cars from the previous-gen release. The PS2 version also included a whole separate roster of cars from the year 2000's running of the 24 hours. And by separate, I mean that they were locked only to the 24 hours of Le Mans mode. You couldn't use any of the legendary GT1 or Group C cars in the big race, nor could you use the modern classics like the Audi R8 or the Corvette C5R at any other race. It's a disappointing and unnecessary partitioning of the game, which undermines the point of the PS2 game's bigger car roster. Another big failing of the next-gen version is that there were minimal class divides. The Group C, GT1, and GTP cars were all lumped together in what the game called the Closed Prototype category, which is the game's equivalent to the aforementioned GTP category. That would have worked for the Group C and GT1 cars because they were already relatively close in performance, with a slight edge actually to the older Group C cars, but the real GTP Toyotas and Mercedes of 1999 were the clear fastest of Melbourne House's closed prototypes. The year 2000 roster also had two ill-advised combined classes. The game's GT class included both the relatively lightly modified GT category cars and the faster and new for 2000 GTS class cars in the same category. They did the same with prototypes, in which the budget and privateer-friendly LMP 675 cars were lumped in the same category as the much faster top-flight LMP 900s. The result was categories with some clearly faster cars that no video game or real-life balance of performance was going to fix. And if you're doing a racing game, the tracks will also matter. Since the games are focused on the 24 hours of Le Mans, obviously, the Circuit de la Sarthe, home of the iconic race, is front and center. Both games also include the Bugatti circuit, a permanent road circuit within the grounds of the Circuit de la Sarthe that shares a few corners and the pit complex. It actually hosted the 1967 Formula One French Grand Prix, although Papyrus Racing Games disliked the track so much that they omitted it from their famous vintage Formula One game, Grand Prix Legends. However, even sharing those circuits in their rosters, there are significant differences between the two generations of Le Mans games. The versions of both tracks in the PS1 game are compressed compared to their real-world and next-gen counterparts. So while a lap in a GT2 car around Le Mans in real life would take around 4 minutes, and around the same time in Le Mans 24 hours, the test drive Le Mans version can take under 1 minute 40 seconds, or a little under 40% of the real driving time. That's closer to the real-world lap time running around the Bugatti circuit in those cars. That circuit also got the compression treatment with GT2 lap times in the 45-second range in the PS1 game. This was generally accomplished by shortening up the straights between the corners, though the Indianapolis section, Porsche curves, and Ford chicane feel much tighter than their real-world counterparts. The PS2 versions of these tracks are built to real-world specs, so video game performance boosts aside, you get a more realistic portrayal of the tracks in the next-gen version of the game. The big difference comes in the rest of the tracks. Trundling around the same two circuits would get a little dull before long, so each game has some extra tracks for you to drive. Eutechnyx and Melbourne House took two very different approaches in this. Test Drive Le Mans includes 4 fictional circuits that are named after famous corners of the Le Mans circuit, but share no other real-world connections. Each is designed to be a different style of track to provide a different challenge, and also designed to be run in reverse to pad out the number of tracks in the game. Le Mans 24 Hours brings 5 licensed, real tracks to the game to bring some variety to your experience. The likes of Donington Park, Suzuka, and Catalunya appear with shorter variants. For the first time I saw in a video game, we got the Brno circuit in Czechia. The PS2 version of the game also adds the Road Atlanta circuit. For the likes of Donington, Catalunya, and Brno, each of the 3 circuits were on the 1999 FIA Sports Car Championship calendar, while Suzuka and Road Atlanta each host famous sports car races of their own, so each of this game's additional circuits are not only real, but have sports car racing pedigree to justify their inclusion. Speaking of different approaches, we need to get to the driving physics eventually, so let's get that out of the way now. These games take 2 very different approaches to how their cars drive. I can safely say that neither gets to full simulation, but there is still a difference in how they drive. Test Drive is definitely the more arcadey of the 2 games. The cars are incredibly fast, with GT2 cars reaching up to 230 miles per hour. Back in the day, The Mulsanne Straight at Le Mans saw Group C race cars reaching 250 miles an hour after a 6-kilometer straight run. By the time of these games, the Mulsanne Straight was no longer a full run, but interrupted by 2 chicanes, leaving no straight longer than 2 kilometers, so real GT2 cars aren't getting anywhere close to Group C speeds on the much shorter straights. And each car is rated on various attributes like top speed, so inexplicably, this Larber competition GT2 Porsche rated at 5 out of 5 top speed is faster than this Pilot Racing Ferrari 333 SP Le Mans prototype, which is only rated 2 out of 5 in top speed, when reality would have the prototype significantly faster than the GT2 car. And the unrealistic performance extends to how they corner. The cars feel like they have an appropriate amount of low-speed mechanical grip, because cornering speed in slow corners isn't outlandish. However, cornering speed in faster turns is ludicrous, with speeds that might compete with what a Formula 1 car could do in similar turns, and some of those feel like they're outside the realm of possibility too. The logical conclusion is that while the tire physics are realistic, the cars have all the downforce possible. Wait. I worry what you just heard was the cars have a lot of downforce. What Eutechnics said was, give me all the downforce you have. And all that grip means the cars are incredibly stable, so much so that the only time you'll spin your car is on the grass, on contact, or driving through oil. Le Mans 24 Hours is considerably more realistic in its approach to handling. The car's speeds are much closer to their real-life equivalents, and you don't have to worry about the lower-class GT cars outperforming the prototypes. Their handling is also somewhat closer to real life. Braking feels too good to be true sometimes, so you can really throw a car into the corner to effect some dive bomb overtakes. Unlike Test Drive, the cars in 24 Hours aren't on rails, and can spin out if you take a corner wrong, though it never seems to spin under brakes, only under power out of the apex of a corner, and even then it often feels like the car just snaps on you. One part of the handling model that Melbourne House did get horribly wrong is the rain. It takes an absolute monsoon of downpour before your tire choice impacts the handling of your car in the wet. There were races that transitioned from dry to wet, and my fastest lap time was set on a wet track with dry weather tires, and I even broke the game's lap record when my car should have been seconds off the pace because of the lower traction in those conditions. Adapting to changing weather conditions is a routine part of endurance racing, and correct tire choices are crucial. See the Audi documentary Truth in 24. But it almost doesn't matter here. And I realize I spend a lot of time in my life playing racing games, so my perspective's a little skewed. But both these games are incredibly easy. I played Test Drive Le Mans primarily on professional difficulty, which differs from the easier amateur difficulty by adding faster AI, tire wear, car damage, and engine overheating, which is impacted by adjusting your engine's rev limiter. This also culminates in the ability and high frequency of other cars retiring from the race, most often on the side of the road with their engines ablaze. That's where the aforementioned oil comes from. It's weird in amateur difficulty when all 12 cars are still running, but there's random oil that's dropped on the track. Anyway, I was still nearly sweeping championships in the slowest cars in each category, so either I'm destined for esports, spoilers I'm not, or the game is quite easy. Le Mans 24 Hours does make things a little more difficult on its expert difficulty. The AI has incredible qualifying pace, impossible straight line speed, and far faster pit stops than you have, but can't string together a race to save its life. So by keeping the car straight and on the tarmac, winning races was not difficult. Unless you're doing a short race without pit stops, or are racing at Le Mans, a track that is basically all straightaways. This does bring me to the fact that 24 Hours is missing out on things like car damage, rev limiters, retirements, and oil flags, so it feels like there are pieces missing from the original game. You'd think that those are little things, but they're so incredibly rare in games that I feel like Eutechnics actually kinda outdid themselves with that. The Ride to Hell, guys! The Ride to Hell, guys! did something above and beyond. Melbourne House does have its own little differences in their game with the addition of different engine types, that being sprint, endurance, and balanced, as well as gear ratios. I'm not sure that the engine types make a difference though. Properly gearing cars can make a difference to an extent. However, outside of Le Mans, I almost always use the sprint engines and the acceleration gear ratio set, which basically defeats the purpose of adding those extra elements. So we've covered what you're driving, where you're driving, and how it all drives, but what about the races you're racing in? Both games obviously have the famed 24 Hours of Le Mans, which you can set to run at varying lengths. Because the PS2 game has Road Atlanta, they also licensed the inclusion of the Petit Le Mans, but only as a 10-hour timed race rather than the 1,000-mile distance limit that the race can also end at. I think. I could never be arsed to run the full 10-hour Enduro to see if it stops at 1,000 miles. You can set the Enduros from about 10 minutes in length to their real length. Yes, you can save during the longer races so you don't have to do the whole race in one go, which is fortunate, because winning the full-length races is necessary to unlock all the cars in the PS2 game. In the PS1 game, unlocks aren't gated behind race lengths, but rather difficulties and classes. Outside of the big Enduros and the standard quick race and time trial modes, both games have what they call championships, but they take very different approaches. 24 Hours has a series of small championships based on car class or race length. I'd say it's more akin to a challenge mode than a championship. Test Drive does have a challenge mode in which you take one of the slowest cars in a class and try to win sprint races to unlock a faster car for the next race, and continue until you complete the 3 or so races in the challenge. 24 Hours championships will only go as high as 5 races in length, but all the races take place under the same conditions, all the tracks feel roughly the same, regardless of the fact that they're all real-world tracks. Doesn't seem like there are any unique challenges to maximizing speed at each track. And as you progress, you have more wet weather races, so everything in the game looks very grey. However, Test Drive's bread and butter mode is its championship mode. Calling it a championship mode does it a disservice because it's less a championship mode and more a career mode. You start with offers from the 2 slowest GT2 teams and try to make the best of it. As you run a season, you will receive offers for the next season based on your performance, so you can go from the worst team in the game and drive your way into a class's top car or into the next class up. Your goal is to race all the way from the GT2s through prototypes and into the flagship GT1 category, winning races and championships along the way. And there are the 2 aforementioned difficulty levels, amateur and professional, if you want a different level of challenge. While I spent the bulk of my time in both games in their respective championship modes, running the 24 Hours of Le Mans over and over again would have had diminishing returns. It's more the career mode aspect and the variety of events, such as different weather, time of day, and the reliability and speed of other cars, that we had in Test Drive that makes it feel like it has the far superior championship mode. For me, it comes down to the fact that I wanted to keep racing Test Drive's championship mode, while 24 Hours is one that I just tolerated. I was more interested in the cars I was going to unlock than the actual battling on the track. That's in part because of how the PS2 game divided things up into these mini championships, and part with how, despite the fact that the handling model was more realistic, it just never really felt like it was that fun racing. I'd get into graphics, but when you're comparing across generations for something that's supposed to look realistic, there's not much point. That sort of art style won't help cover the relative lack of power of the PS1 to the PS2. However, emulation does a good job of cleaning up the car models, showing something that looks more than serviceable and gives you an idea of what people thought the games looked like back in 1999 and 2001. I can provide a little insight into some of the design choices and nuances of the game's visuals. There's a big difference in the color saturation between the 2 games. The previous gen version had a lot brighter colors on the cars and in the environment. The next gen version had more muted colors. Now, which one is more realistic, you might wonder? Well, that depends. That's a terrible answer, but bear with me for a moment. Color saturation, especially when watching motor races at that pre-HD 4K TV time, depends on your perspective. Now, If you go to a NASCAR race, for example, there are many paint schemes and cars with colors just pop in a different way than they do on TV. I always use the example of Mark Martin's Kellogg's car. It looks bright yellow on TV, but it's basically luminous when you actually see it in person. So I would say that Test Drive Le Mans looks quite appropriate for the at-the-track experience, while Le Mans 24 Hours reminds me more of what I would see on TV. Personal preference will play a part in which style you prefer. Personally, I like the pop of color from the previous version more. But one massive visual difference between the two games is the lighting. Normally, this is where you would expect me to say that the next-gen capable is doing things with the lighting that a developer on the PS1 couldn't dream of. However, it turns out to be the exact opposite. You see, racing at night is a perilous journey into the dark at 200 miles an hour. You have little warning of what's coming next ahead, other than some reflective markers and taillights. You're basically relying on muscle memory and instinct to get you around the track. Test Drive actually does a really good job of emulating that in the video game. Your car's lights are a little better than reality, but you still can't see anything much other than what's directly in front of you. If you don't know the track, you're going to have a bad time. One of the biggest faults I have with 24 Hours is that it seems so simple to get the night part right, and Melbourne House didn't. There's a permanent level of light that negates the need for headlights, so 24 Hours doesn't include any real headlight illumination. There's nothing hidden in the dark because there isn't really a dark for you to drive into. It's disappointing because it eliminates both an element of realism and an element of difficulty. Audio also has some interesting differences. Eutechnics went out and got former racing driver and prominent British motoring journalist Tiff Needell to do commentary for the game. In fact, Tiff might be the highlight of this game. While even to this day TV-style commentary in sports games can be hit or miss, Tiff absolutely nailed it. Tiff's contributions include track profiles before the race, team profiles on the starting grid, and race commentary that often included admonishing the driving standards of the player.
Whoa! Was that really necessary? His experience has really shone through, and he's in the lead. Ooh, a lot of repairs will be needed after that. And that was a great performance, although he'll be kicking himself for missing out on first place.
Le Mans 24 Hours had none of this. In line with it being the more serious game, it was silent with the exception of music and car sounds, and even then both were incredibly quiet. I never really thought about the sounds in comparison to each other prior to making this video, but 24 Hours' relatively quiet audio does detract from the overall atmosphere of the game. At the very least, the cars sound different to each other in the PS2 game. The PS1 game's cars had similar sound, but with the pitch adjusted higher for each faster class. I don't think that the GT2 Viper with a thundering 8-liter V10 sounded the same as a Ferrari prototype. That said, I don't think there are more than a few different engine sounds in the PS2 version, but there's more than one, so it's a start. It definitely does suffer from the poor music and the lack of tiff in comparison to the PS1 game. Usually when I do one of these retro versus videos, I find that it's not hard to make my final decision as to which game I like more. By the time I play both games I'm looking at and size them up in writing my review, I find myself gravitating towards one game over the other. With Test Drive Le Mans and Le Mans 24 Hours, I find myself fairly divided. On the one hand, I like playing racing games that make you work for it behind the wheel. I want a game where you have to work hard to maximize your speed while driving the car. Test Drive's unrealistically high downforce and horsepower really gives the game an arcade-style feel to the handling, and that's generally not something I gravitate towards. There is still a challenge to maximizing your speed. Sure, how you drive the car is unrealistic, but there's some serious commitment and precision required to take full advantage of the cornering speed that the high power and downforce allows. The PS2 game does almost the exact opposite, where it punishes you quite badly for pushing beyond the capabilities of car and driver, given your car can actually spin and trackside grass and gravel acts like flypaper. It's a classically inspired approach to endurance racing where you can't take the car for a 24-hour sprint to the finish. With the length of pit stops in the game, you're certainly encouraged to be ginger with the car and conserve tires and fuel to minimize pit stops and pit stop time. So both games have their pluses and minuses, but which do I prefer? Coming back to these games to review them for this video, I remembered Melbourne House's take on Le Mans being the better one. It looked better, the cars drove more realistically, and it actually had real racetracks. In my memory, the biggest knock on 24 Hours was it had that common early PS2 problem of excruciatingly long load times. But as I got to playing more of 24 Hours for this video, I realized that it had some incredibly bad difficulty balancing that took the fun out of it. Sure, the hardest difficulty on Test Drive is so easy that you can win Le Mans overall with the slowest GT2 car, but you have to work for it. 24 Hours swings the other way, where the fastest LMP 900 car struggles to pass a GT car on the straight if the difficulty is set too high. Test Drive actually allows you to push your car, doesn't engage in soul-crushing punishment for going a millimeter onto the grass, and actually allows for battling with other cars rather than encouraging you to just wait for the AI to make a mistake. It's almost like Test Drive Le Mans is a precision racing game, and Le Mans 24 Hours is a precision driving game. And while both genres definitely have their merits, just look at the popularity of the likes of iRacing. If I want to race the 24 Hours of Le Mans in a video game, I want a game that's actually going to encourage the racing part. When I went into this, and given my past experiences with the developer, I never thought I'd say this, but in this Le Mans Classic battle, I'm giving the win to you Technics and Test Drive Le Mans. I guess if we were to go back to the original question of would this be better for the virtual 24 Hours of Le Mans than R-Factor 2, my answer would be it couldn't be worse. The running of virtual Le Mans certainly has certain standards that the ACO and its sponsors are targeting, with getting something as close to a real-world style broadcast, complete with visual fidelity, graphics packages, and world-class entrance. You probably don't get any of that with a PS1 game, regardless of how much you turn up the emulator. Not to mention that even if either game had the multiplayer capabilities that Virtual Le Mans requires, they're limited on the number of entrants compared to a modern PC game. So neither classic Le Mans game would be quite what would be expected of a modern esports event, but the last Virtual Le Mans event sure as hell wasn't either, so from that regard, it would almost be a wash. Almost, because I think it's a safe assumption that you'd have an easier time keeping a PS1 or PS2 emulator running for 24 hours than whatever the hell this is. And that will do it for this episode of Retro Versus. Which Le Mans game takes the checkered flag for you? Leave your opinion down in the comments section below, along with any memories of playing Test Drive Le Mans or Le Mans 24 Hours, or whatever these games were called in your part of the world. And while you're scrolling down there, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new or looking for more looks at classic video games. I do both these long-form review videos and Let's Plays of classic games that I've never played before on the channel. Share the video on social media, follow on social media. The social media handle is Unsilent on Air for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and just about everywhere else. And don't forget, there's plenty more looks back at the great and not so great in retro gaming. There are playlists on the screen, in the description down below, and more videos anytime on the channel page. And until the next time, I'm Unsilent. Thanks very much for joining me. Like, share, subscribe, and we will see you next time.